and then when Don says go, I will go ahead and start broadcasting.
Okay.
Okay, here we go.
Good afternoon, folks. Just a point of timing. We will begin the panel discussion in approximately 1 or 2 minutes, allowing time for folks to sign on. So thank you for joining us, and we'll be back with you momentarily. Okay, folks, I think we're ready to begin. My name is Don Seitz, class of '79, and a proud member of the Princeton Entrepreneurship Council, which is very pleased to host this afternoon's online panel discussion. Really excited to share with you that we had over 400 registrants to today's panel discussion, and really fascinating, representing 8 decades of years of graduation, going all the way back to the 50s, and then continuously through each decade up through the current graduating class, which of course many members are participating today as students, but participating also from their homes. We also have many friends and parents that are part of that 400 plus registration total. So a wonderful mix that we are very excited to have you participate today. This online panel discussion is special in 3 ways. Number one, and most importantly, because of the current health crisis impacting the Princeton community, our entire country, and our entire world, it's special to be able to transition this from a live event, which it was originally scheduled to be, to this online event, and to make it available to many more Princetonians, students, and guests as a consequence of that. Number 2, this is an event that is featuring some esteemed Black Princeton alumni. And for context, over just about a year ago, we hosted the first TigerTalks event that featured also Black alumni. It was co-hosted by my dear good friend, classmate, Bruce Lincoln, who's co-founder of Silicon Harlem. We actually hosted that event up in Harlem, where we had 150 or so people attend, and it was a great panel discussion. Today's session, coordinated by a wonderful planning committee of PEC and many Black alumni, led to the decision to have a second TigerTalks. And that, of course, that was highlighted by the Thrive conference several months ago, where the first day was devoted to entrepreneurial programming. So really excited as a second point of special nature to host this Black alumni featured Tiger Talks. And then third, the topic from corporate to entrepreneur was contributed by many attendees of previous events who wanted to hear more about the journeys of people who started in corporate America in one industry sector or another, and then transitioned to the startup world. And we amended that, of course, given today's environment, to also talk about what now, given the daunting challenges we all face. But for all three of those reasons, really special that we are together today, and I thank you very much for joining us. Very quickly, this Tiger Talks event reflects the mission of Princeton Entrepreneurship Council, which is to engage the ecosystem of alumni, of faculty, of students, and the broader community in three major areas: educational programming, hence Tiger Talks as one version of that, along with many workshops that we now produce, conferences, like the Thrive Conference, but also conferences that we've recently held in New York City and in San Francisco, as well as a conference we held down in Princeton earlier this year, focusing on arts entrepreneurship, but a host of educational programming opportunities, mentoring and advising, both people seeking advice as well as alumni wanting to give advice. And there's a wonderful mentoring platform that we host to accomplish that. And then a range of funding initiatives spotlighted now by the existence of 2 chapters of Princeton Alumni Angels that we'll talk about a bit later. So before I hand it off, I'm always asked a question, and we posed the question even during the registration process: how can you engage? And you can see the list of things here, those events and workshops I just mentioned, subscribing to a wonderful newsletter that Wright Cineris of our staff handles, engaging with that entrepreneurial mentoring platform that we call Office Hours, becoming part of or contributing to all the great work that Princeton Alumni Angels now does to promote Princeton startups and give interested alumni the opportunity to invest in them. And then we have an exciting project called the Ecosystem Map that you'll be hearing more about, but really built around the notion that we really want to connect people in the ecosystem. And the map lets people know where they are, what they're doing, what their skills are, what their levels of interest are, et cetera, so that you can truly engage with each other. Lots of social media channels, a wonderful podcast that is produced regularly, so many ways to engage. Please let us know how you want to engage, and we'll connect you with the right people. So very quickly, logistically, for today's Zoom panel discussion, and I suspect by now many of us have experience with Zoom, but we're going to plan on about an hour of content. The first 40 minutes will be a great conversation between and among the panelists, followed by as many questions as you have, and we'll try to get to many, if not all of them, before the end of the hour. And the panelists have agreed to stay around for a little bit more time. So if there's interest, we're going to try to deliver on that interest. There will be a couple of polls, one coming up in a moment. Please take a couple minutes to respond to the poll. We'll share with you the results of that poll. And at the end, we're going to ask you for some additional feedback so that we can also get content ideas for the future, much like this content, this theme for today's Tiger Talks was driven by previous input. There is a Q&A function probably at the bottom of your screen. You can tap it, open it up. I do encourage you to make sure the tab allows all panelists and also all attendees to see the questions. So usually I think in Zoom, the default is just panelists. Just make sure you toggle down to all panelists and attendees when you write down a question. That way everyone can see the questions, and then you can vote on questions that you are most interested in by clicking on a thumbs up feature. That gives us the opportunity to sort of rank and prioritize the questions that we ask. And feel free to obviously ask the questions broadly or to any of the specific panelists. The chat feature, which is also a icon at the bottom of the screen, should be used only for any technical issues to Neil, who's the technical lead on the Zoom feature or webinar. And also at the end, we'll ask you for some open-ended answers. So let's jump right into the first question, the first poll. And that is, what is your current position? You can pick one or more of these. And then as you scroll through this window that just popped up, we'd also like to know what inspired you to join us today, and what do you hope to get out of it? And while you're asking those questions, I'm really pleased to introduce Laurence Latimer, who will be moderating today's panel. Laurence is a graduate alum from the class of '01. Most recently was head of ventures at a national stock exchange called IEX. And I mentioned Princeton Alumni Angels earlier. He is the co-founder and one of the current managers of the New York chapter of Princeton Alumni Angels. The first chapter, by the way, was orchestrated by alumni out in the Bay Area. So, Laurence, it's all over to you, buddy.
Well, thank you, Don. And as Don mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders of Princeton Alumni Angels of Greater New York. And I suspect many of the folks that are listening to this are receiving some of our literature, or been to some of our events, but we certainly encourage you to attend. Certainly in today's climate, it's as people think about investing in new opportunities, the purse strings may be getting a little bit tighter, but it's still a great time to invest. And frankly, we do plenty of education, networking, and other types of skill building or knowledge building events. So it's not just all about writing a check. There's actually plenty that we do over the course of the year to help you just become a better investor and a better contributor to the broader Princeton entrepreneurial ecosystem. As I said, for the last 5 years, I've been head of ventures for a financial technology firm called IEX. I was responsible for all of our M&A corporate venture investment as well as internal innovation. And I think relevant to the panel today, I started my career at a big company, McKinsey & Company, a consulting firm. But for most of the time, most of my 20-year career has been spent in companies of 100 employees or less, and several times either a founder or single-digit employee. So I have some experience in what we're going to talk about. I'm looking forward to hearing the experiences of many of our panelists. They're going to go through their bios in the context of the questions, so we want to get to that as quickly as possible. But as you're answering the polls, I want to just give a very, very quick intro of each of the panelists. So Karen Palmer, who you see in the upper left, from the great class of 1984, had a 20-plus year career in media and entertainment on the production supervisory side, was at CBS News, CNN, and MSNBC before launching her own executive coaching firm. And actually has a handful of other entrepreneurial activities that she has either led or been involved in over the years. Ramsey Smith from the great class of 1990 had a 20-year career in finance at Goldman Sachs before leaving and launching a digital insurance agency, Alex.fyi. And his latest venture is Alex.fyi, which is a wealth management retirement income solution. Maisha Walker, who I'm sure many of us on this line know from the great class of 94. She's been an entrepreneur for over 20 years, launched her own digital marketing firm, Message Media, in 99, which was sort of right at either the peak or just after the peak of the original .com bust. So I'm really looking forward to hearing her feedback. And before launching her own firm, had worked in publishing and finance as well. Brigitte, upper right hand picture, great class of 2002, has her own firm, Orange Vista, which is a boutique consulting firm. And she also began her career in financial services after spending nearly a decade in finance, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Barclays, and others. And then my very good friend, Eric Plummer, great class of 2010, had started his career at Under Armour and then at Capital One before transitioning onto the entrepreneurship side. Was at a fintech startup before joining Lyft and had a relatively senior role there. And then most recently left to join another earlier stage startup, which I'm sure he will talk about in a bit. So that gives you just a quick sense of who is in front of you. We're going to dive directly into questions. Before that, I want to hand it back over to Don so we can go through the polling real quick and then dive into questions from the panelists.
Great, Laurence, and welcome to all the panelists, and thank you for carving out time today. So here's the really interesting results of the poll. On the first question, as you can see, a fairly well-distributed mix of roles between corporate and startup activity. Actually, one-to-one similarity there. A good number of investors in the group, advisors to other companies or to nonprofits. And as I even mentioned at the outset, a good cadre of students that have joined us today as well, which is just wonderful to have. To all the students, we welcome you, and we are empathetic to the fact that you're all finishing the semester and potentially even your Princeton career as a student at home. But for those who fall into that last category, I can only tell you, and I'm sure the panelists would agree, it only gets better as an alumnus. Second question that I'm scrolling down. So key learnings and what you can do now to make the leap seem to be most on people's minds as to what drew you to the webinar today. So that's great feedback for the panel. Laurence, back to you.
Great. And just Don, just as a refresher, may want to just put up, I don't think the polls were showing. So you may want to just put that up as they're getting into the first set of questions. So for the panelists, this is really a question for everybody. We've got 5 of you here, so we do ask you to be brief, but can you just describe your career arc? From the success that you had early in your career in corporate America, and then that pivot to entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial track. And just try to weave in some of the key elements of your bio in that arc. Sort of, where did you start? All of you had great success, and then you made a choice. Can you just walk us through that? Maybe Karen, if you could give us a start, and then we'll work our way to Eric.
Sure. So I started out, back in the 80s, working my way through all of the ranks of TV news. I started as a desk assistant, which meant, I fetched copy. I ran errands, everything that you get to get your foot in the door. And I worked my way up to being a senior producer supervising programming. So I worked at CBS News, at CNN, at MSNBC. I transitioned from, the corporate, employment in those places into freelance production, where I had the opportunity to work for places like the Tribeca Film Festival. And, I did a lot of different things, when I was really trying to figure out where would I like to land. That's a longer story we'll get into later. But I did everything from teaching media ethics at Fordham. I started my own media training consultancy because one of the things that I saw was that many nonprofits and smaller companies didn't have the budget to go after a firm like Burson Marsteller or Edelman to be able to handle their PR and their presentation consulting. So I did a lot of work for groups like the New York Women's Foundation and Human Rights Watch. And during a period where things were very slow, which is something that you learn about as an entrepreneur, I was approached to be a community advocate for a charter school proposal that was starting up in my home district here in Brooklyn. And, was very, captured by the idea, was an advocate for them, was totally volunteer for a year while I was doing all these other things. And at the end of that year, when the school was, permitted to go forward, I was approached to apply for an actual job. So I ended up becoming the founding director of operations there. And after 3 years of working even harder than I worked in television, I decided that I wanted to step out and use some of the skills that I'd learned for myself, in my own service, running my own business. So I transitioned into an operation consulting business that serves schools and nonprofits, and also does a lot of leadership coaching. And I went back to school to actually become a professional certified coach. And I now do a tremendous amount of coaching for people in education, in media, and in the nonprofit world.
That's tremendous. Thank you. Ramsey, you're next. Give us a sense, right. Long time ago, man. Give us a sense of that arc and what got you to move.
Yeah, so I had an absolutely fantastic career. So I recommend anybody gets a chance to spend even a few years there. I recommend it because you learn a lot about how to do good work and how to work with a lot of smart people. So it was a fantastic experience. And if I think about, the arc of my career was really one that was defined by a lot of what I'll call entrepreneurship. My my business model would change every 3 to 5 years. So despite the fact that I had the same job, I was always in equity derivatives, and I ran a couple of different teams there. One that focused on pension plans in Canada, and then one that focused on life insurance companies. Every 3 to 5 years, where we made our money changed dramatically, and it was that sort of yen for continual creativity that always made me want to do something more entrepreneurial. And especially sort of came to a head, later in my career when, what I thought needed to be done with our client base, which in this case was life insurance companies, was to really focus on helping them distribute their products in a better way, in a simpler way. And that just isn't the way we were set up. We were actually set up to provide sort of creative and complex solutions, which were very good, but that's not the direction I wanted to take with the business. So it's something I needed to do on my own. And I think it's be a very important development for the industry in coming years.
Great, thank you. Maisha, give us a sense of that arc.
All right, can you hear me?
You can.
Yeah, excellent. So I guess I'm a little bit unusual in that I only worked in corporate for 5 years before starting my business. I think that was also a factor of just the time in which I was operating. So as Laurence said, I left corporate right at the height of the dot-com boom, actually, maybe like a year before. But I spent the first 5 years after Princeton first working in finance, first at Neuberger & Berman, which you'll see in my bio, which is an investment management firm. And there I actually spent some time learning all about the world of investing in finance. I took a bunch of classes, worked with a variety of MDs there. Then I left and actually went to publishing, so kind of a weird jump. I worked for a publishing company called K3 Magazine that was known for publishing 17 magazine and Car and Driver were probably the two most famous. Then we also published some smaller titles like Pig World, Dog World.
Ahead of your time.
What's that, Laurence?
You were ahead of your time. The Dog World.
So that actually was fascinating. It was a great opportunity. I'd always been really fascinated by the magazine publishing industry, so it was great to get a sense of what that was like. I was working on the business side, so in the circulation department, which meant that we were responsible for making sure that the magazine continued to get subscribers, and that those subscribers basically paid their bills and renewed. And so we did all kinds of creative work to try to get those subscribers to renew, and then tracking and doing all the printing around all the letters and things that would go out to them. So it was kind of my introduction to Lotus. So for those of you who are too young to know what Lotus is, it is the precursor to what everybody uses now, which is Excel, and which is now becoming Google Spreadsheets. But I totally fell in love. So I did that for a while, and then I left that and actually got a job working with Morgan Stanley. So I'm giving you the really abridged version because some interesting things happened in the middle of that, but ended up working at Morgan Stanley as an analyst for 3 years. And during the last 6 months of my stint at Morgan, decided that I was ready to go out on my own. I've been a programmer. I've been coding as a hobby since I was like 9. And so I picked it back up when the web industry started to become an industry. I worked in the middle of that. I worked for an internet startup too, right before Morgan, and was starting to program in a language called Perl, which again, nobody uses anymore, but it was kind of the precursor to PHP. I was learning MySQL, JavaScript, all that other peripheral stuff too, and thought that I was going to go out and get a job working as a programmer, because a lot of companies like the New York Times Magazine, they had these websites that were really flat, like no database driven content at all. And they were looking for people who could do that. So I went around looking for programming jobs and ended up getting instead a consulting project. And that was what launched me into running my own business as a consultant and then transitioning into running a digital marketing agency, which is what I do now.
Got it. Wow. Very varied past. Thank you. Brigitte.
Good afternoon,
and
everyone.
real quick, sorry. Everyone's bios, longer bios, is now included in the chat function. Don just sent that out. So for anybody that wants to get a little bit more depth on any of the bios that are here, go into the chat function if you're at a computer or on your phone, and go in. If you dialed in, I think we'll send that. I believe Don will confirm. We'll send that out to everybody after the session. So Bridget, sorry to interrupt, but give us a sense
No
of your
problem.
arc.
Sure. So I began my career at a bank as well, at a predecessor to JP Morgan called Bank One. And I had started in a rotational development program that was for recent college graduates that would just kind of give them a holistic view of the finance and accounting function within a major financial services company. And I thought for me, it was a good way to get exposure into functional areas of an organization that you may not want to spend your entire career, but you get to understand how it works in the bigger picture of running an organization. So I worked at that company for about 2 years. It then got acquired by JP Morgan. So I relocated from Chicago to New York and did a little bit of merger integration work there for 2 years. And I learned that mergers are painful and awkward, and the company culture matters more than anything else. But also around that time, I decided that I thought that an MBA was going to be the right and final professional degree for me. So I came back to Chicago, and I attended University of Chicago's Business School in their full-time MBA program, where I got to benefit from a wide variety of experiential learning initiatives. And one of them sent me to Botswana for the spring term of my first year, where I was working on an initiative to support financial inclusion for unbanked and underbanked communities. So spending that time there in an emerging market and finding people that also needed financial access, but needed it in a way that was very different from our Western lifestyles was a phenomenal experience. So after I graduated business school, the company that had sponsored our program was looking to recruit MBA students to do a global rotation program. So I said, why not? Let's keep rotating. So I wound up living in South Africa and Kenya for about 4 years, doing various financial inclusion projects there too, and also a little bit of market research for new product development. And what I learned is that in America, you can kind of launch a new product, or you can kind of figure out who your customer segment is. And in general, there's a lot of robust data out there that's either free or that you can buy to get a feel for who your customer may or may not be. But sometimes in other geographies or in other sort of niche markets, that data can be much more difficult to come by. And so when I came back to the US, I was very impressed by the entrepreneurial hustle I had seen living in the emerging market, where often you find people with very little financial resources, but a lot of social capital, other resources to kind of get things done. And I also had noticed that in the US, this whole ecosystem of innovation spaces had flourished in a lot of urban areas and also at a lot of academic centers. And so with that in mind, I did a little bit of professional development myself, learning how to code, doing a digital marketing boot camp, some leadership professional development workshops as well. And then with that experience, I decided that I wanted to kind of focus more on the healthcare space. So my last corporate job was with a company that was acquired by United Healthcare that did behavioral risk assessments to identify populations that currently have bad behaviors that will be costly for in the long term for insurance companies. So I really enjoyed that experience. And I wanted to kind of create a world where I would kind of continue to work in healthcare, but also cater to my entrepreneurial interests. And so when that company was acquired, I didn't want to stick around for another merger, and I decided to kind of strike it out on my own and then go back to school to study healthcare data science.
That's a lot of mergers. I heard more mergers, in your background. We should all invest in the companies that you go work at. They all get bought out. But what an incredible story. So, Eric, what about you? Let's talk about your arc, because you've been in a number of different corporate environments as well as startup environments.
Yeah. So I guess over the last 10 years, I've had quite the journey. So started off at Under Armour, working in consumer insights there. Got the opportunity to actually, for the first time, launch a product. So we launched a electronic 39. It was Under Armour's original shirt was called the 39. And the E39 was actually a moisture wicking shirt that had the ability to read all these body sensors, and kind of the experience of being able to work with the team there on launching this kind of entrepreneurial project really helped to spur my career forward. Spent about a year after that at Wake Forest getting a master's in business management, and then proceeded over to Capital One for about 3 years, where I first got exposed, I guess, to really the digital side of banking. So spent about a year managing the customer experience on the digital side of Capital One's website, and then got the opportunity to actually run the analytics program for Apple Pay and the digital wallet right after its launch. So I was able to kind of grow that product from about 4,000 users on day one to about 2.5 million users when I left. Also the chance to work in an e-commerce startup where I got to run analytics for them and build a model for them through their Series B fundraise. And then I was like, it's time for me to jump out on my own. Spent a year after that running a financial technology startup with really good friend Jared Crook's class of 2011 called Sultan. And we were trying to help small businesses figure out how to better understand their QuickBooks Online financial data. Wanted to combine my financial background with my experience in digital. Really what I learned from that experience is that entrepreneurship isn't easy, and that honestly life isn't very linear. And from there I actually proceeded back into the corporate world and went to a consulting firm where I helped them to build an analytics practice for the first time. They were trying to figure out how to use data for their mid-sized Midwestern clients and help them to really kind of frame and build that up. Got the opportunity from there to actually go over to Lyft, where I spent 2.5 years helping to grow and build the Detroit, Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati markets in Michigan and Ohio. And then got the chance to lead and run the New Jersey market for a little bit over a year. And then for the last 2 months or so, I've been over at a startup called Peerspace, where I'm helping them to actually run the East Coast markets for them. How do you grow these markets? How do you make them successful? While simultaneously, my wife and I have a real estate development company based in Detroit, Michigan. So her name is Cecily King, class of 2010. And we now have one property kind of under management right now, and then working on a second deal currently. So really focused on this real estate space, both from the day-to-day side corporately in technology for Peerspace, which is a real estate technology company, all the way through personally doing real estate investments on the side.
Got it. Well, thank you. And another incredible journey. So there's been this great diversity in the way you've all approached this. And I want to zero in on just a few of the panelists now. What was that critical moment that led you to make the leap? You know, so some of you have kind of given the high level, but I'd really love you to sort of drill down on that and say, this is the moment, this is the thing. These are the, you know, the 3 or 4 things that happened, or the one thing that said, that told me this is absolutely why I need to make this move, or the circumstances. Karen, I want to start with you. What was that moment like when you said, you know what, I've got to make that leap?
Well, the moment for me is probably one that many people who might be listening to us are familiar with. I got laid off. So I was laid off in the winter of 2005 after having spent the better part of 20 years in one industry. And, you know, although television requires you to make use of, you know, a tremendous, vast number of skills, you know, I really had to sort of step back. And after I went through the requisite period of, you know, grieving and acceptance, I had to ask myself, what do I want my future to look like? And at that point, you know, I was working, you know, fairly brutal hours, you know, and with, you know, a 2-year-old at home, a husband who also was in the business and traveled for a living. And the landscape of television in general, if you're those of you who, you know, are, you know, in that age range, that was when the shift towards reality television had begun. And so the projects that were really hiring and staffing up in big numbers were, you know, things where folks would actually come and say, you know, great, you can work 3 weeks in a row without a day off. And, you know, it just wasn't realistic for me to do that. So I had to take a look and ask myself, you know, is there another way to use the skills that I have in a context that makes sense for where I'm at in my life? And so I stepped into freelance production because that was an easy transition, but also realized that I would need to really explore, you know, something more than that. I did not want to continue on that path. And that's where I came up with the idea, which was really kind of plopped in my lap by a friend, to start a media training consultancy, because it was a time period where a lot of nonprofits were really struggling with the idea of figuring out how can I function, you know, in the digital space. How can I be out there on multiple platforms? You know, when these are folks with small budgets and in some cases very complex missions. And so I found that the background that I had was really useful to places like this. And it also aligned with the kind of, you know, really the purpose that I felt I wanted to really be after in my life, which was more community oriented. So that was what catapulted me into it. You know, I think Eric made a great point. Entrepreneurship is not easy. There are a lot of things I wish I had known before I stepped into that world, sort of, full time. But what I did also was to eventually down the road step back into a job that offered paid W-2 employment for several years. So, for me, the process really was being willing to look at where doors might open. I went through several jobs in that space. One of those jobs offered the opportunity to then, be offered a job to teach. And that was an adjunct position, but it was a great way for me to be entering a new space. And that in and of itself also offered me the opportunity to start thinking more about education, which is what led to the opportunity to volunteer as the community advocate that I'd mentioned before, which is what actually did lead me into continuous paid employment as a W-2 employee for 3 years before I went back out on my own. So the motto there for me is doors will open in strange places. Don't be afraid to step through if it's something that really aligns with your personal mission and that you believe you see a market that you can serve.
Great, thank you. Ramsey, let's go to you and then Maisha on this one. Like, what was that critical moment that caused you to make the leap? Can you give us some color around that in just a couple minutes?
So, look, the investment banking business has changed a lot in recent years. It started to focus a lot more on technology. By the way, these are all good things. But, the mandate I had was very specifically in a product space, in equity derivatives with a certain client base. And, I found that I was working harder and harder for not the same return that I would have gotten 3, 4, 5, 10 years ago. I mean, even from a corporate revenue perspective, and then obviously, the opportunity set for me personally. And where I saw the real opportunity, as I've mentioned before, was to kind of step away from making fancy widgets and actually trying to work with our life insurance companies and just actually helping them with the basic distribution platforms. There was, in my view, there was more consistent revenue and higher revenue there, but it just didn't fit into the way we did business. And there wasn't really any sort of natural fit, really at any bank I can think of, to do something like that. So, it really was a matter of like, okay, the seat I'm in isn't as valuable as it used to be. And the opportunity that I think is really the big opportunity is not one that's a fit here. So that was the key thing for me. It just, it was, and by the way, it was not an easy thing. I loved being at that firm. But, now that I've stepped away, I've never been happier about sort of like where I am in terms of like setting my own destiny.
Got it. Thank you. I appreciate that. And Maisha, that moment, it sounds like you gave a little bit of the color around it, but can you kind of dive in and really kind of blow it out for us?
Yeah, I think it wasn't actually, there's not that far to dive. I think in the investment banking world where I was as a very young, person in that industry, very often in these roles, you spend 2 to 3 years and you're kind of expected to try something else and move on to a different area. And for me, I was looking around, at least back then, that's how it worked. I was looking at what some of the other areas was. I was, talking to a few people about what some opportunities might be. And I really just I didn't find anything that really piqued my interest enough to want to really stay and work towards it. I wasn't really interested in my boss's job or my boss's boss or my boss's boss's boss. And I also then, I think, was a lot less, I understood a lot less about how to navigate relationships, business relationships, and really find mentors and find people who could give me advice. And so I really didn't have a lot of guidance from anyone on how to, maybe there would have been a role there that I could have gone into, and then that wouldn't be where I am now. But I really just didn't know how to navigate that. And it just seems very natural to me to dive into entrepreneurship. I think I've always had an entrepreneurial spirit, even when I was a kid. And so it also just seemed like a great opportunity. When I left Morgan, I had a whole bunch of savings. And as I mentioned, we were right at the cusp of the dot-com boom. There were a lot of opportunities out there. There was a lot of need for coders and people who sort of spoke that language. And so it just really was an ideal time to take the leap. So it wasn't really even that difficult of a choice, at least for me then.
Got it. Well, I appreciate that. let's sort of twist around a little bit as we're sort of getting close to the time. I want to open it up for questions. Brigitte, we'll start with you. What has been the best part of the entrepreneurial experience for you? And you know, kind of the best part, and then what's been the most challenging for you? And you know, any surprises that might have come along the way you weren't expecting?
Yeah, I would say the best part and the most challenging for me are probably one and the same, and it's that I control my time and my projects. And I think that sometimes it can be challenging because as an entrepreneur, you have to eat what you kill. And so I think business in general is based on relationships. And I think sometimes as an entrepreneur, if whatever you're endeavoring to venture upon is sort of an extension of an industry that you've worked in before or relationships you had in the past, oftentimes that conversion can be somewhat easy because you're just taking existing relationships you had before and they're like, oh, we'll pay you to help us solve these problems. But sometimes if you decide that the business that you want to run as an entrepreneur is fundamentally different from maybe what you spent your career and built relationships in, you have to start anew. And I think sometimes when you're looking anew, you have to really think about how are decisions made within an organization, or how will you kind of get that client. And I think in my own experience, just in some of the entrepreneurs that I coach, sometimes people underestimate that cycle of business development and how long it may take and what kind of in-person, face-to-face activities may be involved to get the deal done. I think sometimes people think, oh, you know, I've got a product and it seems like it's competitively priced, therefore everyone wants it. And it's like, no, that doesn't always happen that way. There can be all these subtextual cultural things that kind of shape why a business may or may not want to do business with you. So I think for me, that's been both the best and the most challenging part of being an entrepreneur. And I think one of the other nice parts about being a B2B entrepreneur is just looking at all the different types of businesses that are out there. I think sometimes when you're in large corporate, you just think about, you know, the Fortune 50 or something, and then you think that's where everyone works. And then you realize, no, there are so many small and medium-sized businesses out there. So just kind of parsing out what particular market you want to serve and really kind of pushing yourself in a way that's going to add value is a good way to help challenge yourself to think about, are you being a good entrepreneur?
Great, no, that's awesome. Eric, what about you? Can you talk to us? What's been the best part for you? Entrepreneur, you know, you've kind of been doing it on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. What's been the most challenging, and were there any surprises along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I think growing up and being an athlete, I mean, I think I tend to equate athletics with entrepreneurship quite a bit. And I think simply put, for me, the best part is winning and the worst part is losing. And I think when you think about entrepreneurship, right, winning comes in multiple different forms, right? Mm-hmm. Some of the wins are small wins where you convince a client or a partner to join you on this journey. Some of the wins are actually you landed that big deal and now your business is actually running and it's thriving. And losing takes multiple different forms, right? Like losing can be, hey, you did not win that small BD deal, or hey, losing can be actually you have to shut down your firm and figure out what the next opportunity is, right? And I think you learn a lot through the adversity and through the losing. But like we all love to win, right? We all went to a top school. You did the things that put you in a position to be competitive. And I think entrepreneurship is one of the few places where you get to innately be competitive. I think the comment earlier of like you eat what you kill, right? There's nobody handing you anything. And your desire to win, your desire to, I think winning has limits, right? Winning ethically, I'll say, like your desire to win and your desire to win playing the game the right way creates an opportunity for you to live a life of joy and excitement. But at the same time, every time you win, you have to kind of look over both shoulders, look like watch as you cross the street, because you never quite know where that next loss is coming from. So it's kind of this winning, but this kind of weird paranoia, just trying to make sure that you aren't missing something, to make sure that you can continue to eat going into the future. So.
Got it. That's insightful. And I'm going to pivot to our fourth question, because as I'm seeing some of the Q&A traffic, I think this is very relevant for everybody. I want to give everybody an opportunity to answer this one before we pivot out to Q&A. For those of you in particular, and I'm going to focus more on the folks that graduated a little bit earlier. For those of you that have been an entrepreneur through a downturn, what advice would you give others who are considering making that jump to an entrepreneurial role now, who may never have worked through a downturn before? So Karen, maybe if you want to start, and then we'll pivot to Ramsey and then Maisha.
Yeah. No, I love that question because, you always have to think, how have I not approached this before? um, for me, the two biggest things, again, when I left my corporate employment, back in 2005, it was a very down period for certainly television news. The entire sector was reinventing itself, and I realized there would not be an easy, direct transition for me to stay in that same arena. And so the two things that were the most useful for me and that have proven useful over and over again were, number one, to reactivate my network of contacts, and then to also reevaluate my personal skill set. So on the first, tip, the idea of reactivating your network, if you are doing the same thing for a long time, you tend to stay in touch with the same people in the same arena who may have similar resources, and you're not necessarily looking further afield to, maintain the kinds of contacts that might be useful to you if you end up suddenly needing to pivot. And so you need to reach out to people that you haven't connected with in a while to widen that reach. And not just your work contacts. I mean, we all have the luxury of having this tremendous network just that, that brought us all together today. We have our own personal friends who all do, many interesting and amazing things. And, for example, last week, I just booked a new client through my friend circle who I had not spoken to for quite some time. So you may find that just by reaching back out again and, really, really thoroughly combing your network, that there are a number of people that are more aligned with what you want to do than you realized before. And then the second thing about, looking at your skill set again. If you've worked in an industry for a long time, you tend to think that your skills can only be used in a particular way, the way you've been using them for all those years. Your corporate employer may be inclined to, to have you continue thinking that way. Part of that process of talking to other people in your network is it's great to find out what other people think you do well. What do your friends always ask you to do? What would you be doing if you didn't have to worry so much about money? There are certain things that rise to the top for all of us in terms of what other people see as skills that we have that we haven't necessarily identified so clearly for ourselves. And that information is very valuable and usually pretty actionable.
Got it. Ramsey, anything to build on top of that? Or,
Yeah, I think you hit on all the right points. So look, this is my first downturn as an entrepreneur, but having been a Wall Street guy, I've been through like a ton of them starting in 1987. So I've hit every downturn at some point since 1987 in the context of working on Wall Street. And so I'm familiar with what it means to be in situations like these. What's particularly interesting about this one is that it's much more broad-based. It's an exogenous factor, and it's affecting, it's not just in the financial services industry it's happening everywhere. And we're all having to behave differently. We're all having to do things remotely like this. I think if I was still at Goldman and I had to do this now, I would have been completely, drowning. But after a few years now of being an entrepreneur and dealing with scarcity, right? By definition, if you're an entrepreneur, everything is scarce. People are scarce, money is scarce, skills are scarce. I mean, you have your skills, but you need lots of different skills to put together a good business. And you need to be flexible. You need to be able to work wherever you are. And all those things I think are super valuable, and they're all things that sort of that I certainly have gained in the last few years. And I think that we all have an opportunity to get really good at honing those skills going forward. I think one of the reasons I decided to take this journey is that I've come to the conclusion that entrepreneurial skills are going to be much more important for all of us and all of our kids and grandkids than it was for us. I don't think that corporate America is going to offer the same types of opportunities going forward and the same sort of long careers that existed in the past. I think we need to be entrepreneurial. I think we need to I'm thinking about some of, Maisha's comments. She talked about, she spent 2 or 3 years in Morgan Stanley, and then, she couldn't look around and see something she wanted to do. I actually think that's healthy. I think that in some ways, despite the fact that I followed a very sort of long path that was based on loyalty and a lot of other things, I think that being flexible and moving around, being an entrepreneurial, trying different jobs, I think it's a positive thing to do. And things are going to suck for probably 6 months with the current crisis, but I think we'll be out of it by 2021.
Maisha, I know you've been through a few of them. So based on when you left corporate, I mean, 99, I came out of grad school in '01, so I was in the depths of it. So I know you were living it, and then obviously '08 and you know what we're facing today. So can you give us some insight, you know, that in addition to what Karen and Ramsey have talked about?
Yeah, so this is my third recession as a business owner. I probably shouldn't say the word recession. We're not in a recession. But this is the third time I've been through a downturn as a business owner. And I definitely, having been through it twice before, you know, I didn't know what was going to happen. A lot of people were talking about a recession coming. And so I've been kind of preparing for this for the last 2 years. And really, there isn't a whole lot you can do once it's here. Like, you really just have to be prepared before it gets here. I think it's really smart to have a lot of savings and make sure that if you are already an entrepreneur, you're running your business in a way that you can put aside money, not only for your business to survive and continue to pay bills, but also for you personally. And please don't mix those up. They're very different things. Understanding the difference between your business expenses and your life expenses, and that you really need both. It's very easy to get caught up in the beginning stages of running a business with just, oh, my business is surviving, but I'm actually not, you know, I have enough to pay my rent, that's it. So just making sure that you're really thinking about saving those things. If you haven't started your business yet, and you have a full-time job, I very often, so one of the things I do a lot is teach other entrepreneurs about digital, but a lot of just general business questions come up during those conversations. You know, I encourage people to stay in your day job and run your business while you're working for a year, 2 years. Because you become your own angel investor, right? So you can make really solid strategic decisions about how you run that business when you're not relying on that business to pay your bills. And you can also make smart investments in that business out of your salaried income. It puts you in a really great position of power to do that. I did it for 6 months. It would have been nice if I could have done it longer. But really, the time to prepare for a time like this is way before it happens. So I would say this is in some ways, if you don't have those cushions, this is a terrible time to start a business. Because while there may be opportunities out there, I think it's really smart to take advantage of those opportunities while you're still working. So I shouldn't say a terrible time to start a business. I mean a terrible time to leave your job if you want to start a business. So start the business. I generally would say keep your day job while you're doing it so that you can make better decisions about how you run that business and not have your decisions be driven by your need to eat. I will say that the other two downturns that I lived through and ran my business through, you know, things were incredibly lean. I survived the last one by living with I had already moved home because I was looking for a new apartment. And then September 11th happened, and I ended up just staying home for 3 years, partially because it just seemed like an easier thing to do. It was also a great time to just build a relationship with my dad as an adult, you know. So that was kind of fun, but then it turned out to be a really lucky thing, and I ended up running my business on like $500 a month for a while. I mean, it was intense for a while. So, you know, I would say, if you've got a solid income, keep it. It does not mean that you can't also start a business at the same time. That would be my biggest piece of advice. My other piece of advice, again, would just be, as soon as you've got that income coming in from your business, figure out how you can use it to put aside a little nest egg, both for the business continuity and for your personal continuity. So it's there before you take that full leap into running your business full time.
Got it. I thank you very much. And before we open it up, I'm going to jump into the Q&A. I think Don's going to go. But Brigitte or Eric, do you want to add anything? Is there anything that wasn't covered that you feel really compelled to add?
I think for me, that the one thing that I always like to have entrepreneurs think about is they need to be very clear on what problem their business is solving. And then also making sure, does the market actually need this? I think a lot of times when I'm kind of coaching or mentoring people, they may have a problem that they've kind of experienced personally, and they kind of project and think, oh, this might be a market-wide problem. So really doing a proper investigation as to whether that is a real opportunity or not. And then just being very clear about why you are the best person to address this issue. And then I'm assuming that, you know, the majority of the people on the call are in sort of for-profit business enterprises or have those kind of desires. So getting really clear on what your desired revenue model is, I think is very important as well. So those 4 questions. What problem are you solving? Does the market need it? Why are you qualified to do it? And how will you make money?
Okay, yeah.
And the one thing I would add is just anytime you take an entrepreneurial leap, I think Maisha hit on this really well, is you have to understand your personal finances along with the cost of running a business, along with the potential risk that you're walking into, because those things can all weigh on you really, really quickly. But I think when I think about the recession and the opportunity to start a business, the one thing I think about from like an economic standpoint is the opportunity cost is really low, right? For a lot of people, if the situation in which you end up getting laid off, or you end up thinking about like, well, what does the bottom look like? Well, we're reaching the bottom, right? So like the answer of like what you have to lose at this point is very different. And some people think the opposite, right? And I think there's pros and cons, and everybody has their own calculus there. Some people think when the market's at its height is when you take the leap and you have the ability to kind of go find a job if you need it. I think when it's at its bottom, there are some of the most interesting opportunities. And some of the most innovative companies of our time are started during these downturns. I'll just keep that in mind.
Thank you. And so we're going to pivot to the Q&A. We're going to go into the Q&A area and see what the audience has been writing in and then upvoting. Don, do you want to take us to the first one?
Yeah, great questions. And I encourage everyone on the call to continue asking questions by writing them in and also voting on them. Again, we're going to take all questions in written form as opposed to turn on mics. And well, let's try to run through as many of these as possible with some great questions and some concise answers. The first question, actually, since it was, I think, touched upon by both Karen and Eric in terms of the Princeton Alumni Network, and how has the network and the community at large assisted each of you in your career paths and journeys? And Eric, you might want to start that a single answer, and maybe we'll go over to Ramsey, and then we'll move on to another question.
Yeah, I mean, I think in short for me, it's been inspiration, right? Like I think when you get the chance to look at the network and you get to see all of the people doing all of these amazing, interesting, intriguing things, for me, it's simply inspiration. And then the ability to lean on others who have gone through this path before to be able to learn. I think that's probably one of the smartest things you can do before you take this leap at all, is just ask a lot of questions of people who have already done it to figure out kind of if it's the right thing for you.
My turn?
Yes.
All right. So yeah, I would just, I first want to very quickly agree with what Brigitte said earlier about like your network. Your network is bigger than you think. And if you really go out, you're going to find people that you forgot about. And there's way more people out there that know you, remember you, and will want to work with you than you probably realize. Look, the Princeton network has always been good for me. Going back to my college days, I have much of my career to thank for it. In the context of being an entrepreneur, it's been good. I think there's a lot more upside. I would like to actually connect with even more members of the Princeton network. But so far, it's been fantastic.
Can I add something super quick in there, Don?
You certainly may.
Because I actually really leveraged the Princeton network when I first started my business. I actually went directly to the Alumni Careers Network. If you guys haven't done that, through TigerNet, you can go online and search for alumni. You log in with your ID and you can search for alumni who have particular skill sets or interests or in different industries. I know the Princeton Entrepreneurial community also has a website that has a list of mentors. I was really surprised at how giving people were. People met me for lunch. People got me job interviews. It was really incredible. So I would really tap into the network of like strangers who don't want to be strangers in the Princeton alumni community. And then I also did use TigerNet a lot. The list, the email discussion groups for some of the students and younger alums. You may be a little less familiar with those, but they're very active and there's a lot of great resources and people out there willing to answer your questions. I shared a lot of content on those when I was first starting in digital and they were great. And when I left Morgan Stanley, the very first consulting job that I got was through TigerTalks, was through people I was interacting with and met, and then built a relationship with these two alums who started a finance company, and I went in and did some consulting with them. So don't be afraid to tap into the alumni community through the resources that are already available. People really do want to help.
Great. So thank you, all you guys. So for the next question, it's a fundraising question. So I'll try to steer those towards those that may be in companies that have a more traditional venture capital trajectory, as opposed to those that may not. How do you approach fundraising if you're trying to avoid venture capital firms? Maybe you're too early, but you don't have a bunch of rich friends and family to seed your enterprise. Maisha, you've been around for a while, service business, but I'd love you to answer this one. I think Ramsey, I'm a little bit more familiar with Alex. I know this is on that venture trajectory. And then Eric, you've been in a handful of very early stage firms that are on a venture trajectory. Can you walk through that for you three? And then obviously, Karen, Brigitte, if you have others to add, I'd love to hear your perspective as well. But Maisha, the Ramsey to Eric.
So mine's going to be really fast. I already mentioned, keep your day job for one thing. I think if you can get a job where you can fund your own business, it really puts you in a position of power to make a lot of decisions. Obviously, some fundraising that's not feasible. You just need to raise more funds or raise them faster, and then you can't do that. But definitely, if you can run the business, minimum viable product, while you're in your day job, I would definitely try to do that. I have not been through the process of actually fundraising for my business, so I can't comment on that. But I can speak a little bit also to the idea of crowdfunding, which in my industry has become huge, and the ability to create a brand to get on a crowdfunding site to raise money from the public for your business is something you should definitely look at.
I'll pop in. It's Ramsey. So, look, I have self-funded my business up until now, and for a long time, I was very comfortable with doing things that way because I wanted to be able to build the business the way I wanted to. So I'm really sort of still in the early stages of raising. I've spoken to lots of VCs. I'll probably speak to a whole lot more. I think though, like, you have to really take a look at your business and first decide whether or not your business is something that fits in the VC model, right? And then also ask yourself if there are potential other sources that might be useful. So in case of my business, it could be VCs, it could be angels, but frankly, I think that the best investors, as I go through these cycles, may actually be strategic, may be my insurance company partners. So, really a lot of it has to do with not just, it's not just your strength of your personality and everything else. It's also, is it a business that fits the VC model? And actually there are good businesses that don't necessarily fit the VC model. So it's very important to be clear on whether it's a business that can be grown very, very quickly and for which success or failure is determined very quickly, because that tends to be the model that's more appealing in the VC space.
I just want to add something as well. So I think for high growth businesses, if you are in that stage where you don't actually want to ask an investor for money, but you do want to be on their radar and their realm of awareness, I think that participating in competitions, pitch competitions and whatnot are very helpful just to kind of be aware, because many of those people who are in the room are investors that are scouting for talent. And then also, I think boot camps are really helpful as well to just kind of get you exposure as well. There's in a lot of these innovation spaces and a lot of events that you get invited to with, free pizza and beer. A number of people in those rooms are often looking for the next venture that they want to invest in. So those are definitely ways to be there, but not ask for anything yet.
Hey, Laurence, I see a couple questions I'm going to combine, and maybe Karen and Eric can take a stab at these. Both sort of related to, if you put on your young corporate self face on, what advice would you give folks who are considering making the leap into the entrepreneurial space if you're currently in the corporate space, but at the same time if you're a current student, and we have many students in the audience today, and particularly in the face of, the crisis and the pending recession that we're seeing, is this a good time to actually take the risk, do you think? Your thoughts for both of those segments of our audience would be great.
Well, I think Maisha's point, to being very, very attentive to your finances is huge. I think certainly as a younger person, I didn't think as much about the future of saving, certainly not in a business context. It's once that grew on a personal level, it became clear as to why. But if you have any entrepreneurial leanings at all, you really do need to start putting some money aside so that you have the ability to kind of get out there and test your theories, do your market research, to be able to fund the exploration that will allow you to decide whether or not your business really is a viable concept. The other thing that I would definitely say is it comes back again to growing a network. When we're younger, we often tend, if we're working in a corporate context, to think of networking as something that happens between, people in our own companies or in similar companies. And, if you have interests, certainly ones that lie outside of what you're doing now, the younger you are, the more that you can explore those. Using a tool like the Alumni Network is an absolutely perfect way to speak to people who can give you valuable insight into those things to decide whether or not it's something that, you really want to test out yourself.
Yeah, and a couple of thoughts on top of that here. One, I think the best way to learn kind of in your early career is to find a place that aligns with what you want to do entrepreneurially, right? Like for me, I was lucky enough to end up at Capital One in their digital practice. So when I went to go launch my fintech company, I had the knowledge from them. I spent the time using their resources to understand what I wanted in order to kind of grow my own business. I think two, the other thing is like the younger you are in your career, the less you have to lose. And I say that intentionally because even now, 10 years out with a wife, a mortgage, a kid, like every day it becomes more and more costly for us to take risks. But I think earlier on, even if these ideas didn't go very far, the ability to explore that entrepreneurial side, I think is really important. At Princeton, you learn how to learn. I think the ability to learn how to be entrepreneurial and to like flex those muscles before you find the big one is really, really important. Because it's often really hard when you find that really great masterful idea and you don't know what to do with it or how to execute on it to actually get it to the market. So I think it's learn to do it very often and learn from where you are, like take advantage of the resources you have to make the most of it.
Yeah, great points. Hey, Laurence, before we continue with questions, I'd like to ask Neil to launch just one more poll. A vast majority of us are still on the call. And so we will continue taking questions. We'll get back to those in a second, but please take a moment for the benefit of the PEC team. One, just give us thoughts as to the effectiveness and value of this particular session tonight. And equally importantly, give us a sense of the time frames that work for you, because we plan on many more digital events over the next 3 months. So your preferences, given where you live, et cetera. Please answer this, however, with the reference point of Eastern Standard Time so that we can benchmark the responses. And then separately, please use the chat feature and suggest topics, because as I said at the outset, this topic culminated because many attendees of previous events wanted to talk to sort of the mid-career transition choices that we make as entrepreneurs. Thank you for answering these questions, and we'll continue with the Q&A.
Yeah, just being respectful of time, we'll try to get to 2 more, and I think they may be able to position one question 2 questions into one. But for everybody here, but I think in particular those folks that have been at it a little bit longer, what are the key characteristics that you see for successful startups versus those that wind up failing? And I think a related thing is, given that historical perspective, what's been the difference, where do you see the greatest opportunities going forward? Whether it's industry, geography, skill sets, different types of roles, kind of where do you see some growth opportunities going forward? And maybe starting with Karen.
Mm. I actually look at this time, as difficult as it may be, as a time of great opportunity. I think a number of us are going to have to go through this period of reevaluation of how we've run our careers. On the other side of this, there is going to be some pretty volcanic change in a lot of different industries. There will also, I think, be a lot of innovation. So, for example, in the work that I do now in coaching, a number of people have reached out because they're having those thoughts of, I don't know if the business I'm currently working for on the other side is going to be open. I don't know whether or not my job will still be there when it's time to come back. And I want to explore what is next. I want to do that on my terms rather than waiting for someone else to tell me what's going to happen to me. And so I think if we can look at this time as being a time where we can, in whatever context we're working, think about how we contribute to building that sense of innovation and also building community between people who may not know what the next point is. I think there really is a tremendous opportunity to shift us into a very different way of thinking that will benefit everybody across all sectors.
Got it. Ramsey.
Sure.
Brigitte, Maisha, really, this is an open question for this one.
Yeah, look, I think there's so much space for greater efficiency in the way our economy runs and the way we live our lives. I think that, again, one of the outcomes of this crisis is that we're all going to learn both the potential and at least the current limitations on doing things remotely. But there's no reason we can't get, more medical advice remotely, financial advice remotely, you name it. There's one of the things I see in my industry, in the insurance industry, there's still a lot of things that are done on paper. There's still a lot of paper applications. Like, who would have thought that would be the case anywhere now? So everywhere I look, there's just things that could be done better by machines, or where we're assisted by machines. And so I think that there is just huge potential that in almost every sector that we live in. Now the tough part is, are all of us going to be able to adapt? So the folks that are students on this call, you have the luxury of being able to see this coming and actually sort of growing up in an environment where these things are more native to you. So run with that. And for those of us that are a few years older, like, it's really going to be incumbent on us to adapt. But I think that that's the future. I think we should embrace it. I just want to hop on one other thing from the last question, which was about how young people should be thinking, and Eric hit the nail on the head about sort of what you have to lose. The people I've known that have been most successful, and certainly, I can sort of speak for myself, where I think a lot of what contributed to my success is when I was young, like, I was willing to do whatever it took, right? Obviously, ethically, legally, et cetera, but like, sleep on a couch, right? Skip a meal, whatever it took, right? I wanted to do well. And that attitude and being on your own and not having the responsibility of an entire family, et cetera, liberates you to do a lot of things, to experiment, to fail, to learn from your failures, and spend a few years at a company or try to build a business. But you should be hungry and attacking the opportunity every day.
Hey, a couple other questions I think we can combine, and I'm going to open this up to anyone actually, which is, first, what's the one key skill or experience that you think is sort of a prerequisite to jump into entrepreneurship successfully? And sort of the flip side of that, what would you have done differently in your own careers as you have taken this path towards entrepreneurship?
I think I can speak to, oh, go ahead, Brigitte.
Oh, thank you. I was going to say, I think the ability to be very flexible is very important. So just thinking about all the different skill sets you have, And I know that, as Princetonians, we're probably a lot of sort of type A overachievers who think that things should happen in a linear way, and that as an entrepreneur, oftentimes things do not happen in a linear fashion. So just, when plan A doesn't work, not being sort of stumped or kind of discouraged, but ready to kind of go with plan B and recognize that, success will kind of manifest itself in different ways. I definitely think that's important.
So I completely agree with that. I also think we tend to think that things were going to happen a lot faster than they actually do. One of the things I've learned as an entrepreneur is things always take so much longer when you're creating something new than you think it's going to take. So just having that patience and seeing it through. I also was speaking on a panel with some really successful entrepreneurs a few years ago. One of them said something that I thought was so key that has completely dovetailed with my experience, that she thought the single most important skill set for someone starting a business, especially if it's a business that you plan to have employees or at least consultants working with you, is learning how to hire. That a lot of us start businesses because we have a talent or a skill. We start these lifestyle businesses, but ultimately it's very difficult to make enough money as an entrepreneur if it's really only you doing the work, unless you're charging a lot of money on every project that you work on. So for many of us, we need to learn how to break down the work that we're doing in ways that we can bring on a team, even if it's a team of consultants or part-time people, project-based people. And it's really important to learn how to do that, how to figure out what can be delegated, how to figure out how to find those people, how to figure out how to keep them, make them inspired. And so my strong recommendation is to really figure out the numbers of your business and make sure that you know that you need to hire people or you don't. Are you going to be able to get projects that you can charge $100,000 for and work by yourself? Or are you going to get projects where you're going to charge 10 grand and you're going to need to have a lot of volume, which you can't do by yourself? And if you do need to bring on people, hire early. Don't try to do everything yourself in the beginning. Learn how to bring those people on as soon as you can so you can learn that skill set.
Great. Well, I
have
think
one other
that's.
thought.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No.
Is that Karen?
Yeah. I was going to say very quickly, I think I'm the only person on this panel who does not have any formal finance background. So my recommendation to all of you young folks who may be in the same boat is to go get some finance background, whether it is, taking the courses that allow you to understand the basic mechanics of starting and running a business, leveraging the Princeton alumni network, talking to people who work in finance. I had to get a lot of the really important background information on my own, guerrilla style, which was a fascinating ride and also pretty sickening at points. There are mistakes that I made that would have been remedied by having much more information at my fingertips. And so I think it is really important for people to understand the basics. You don't have to have an MBA, but you do have to have a real framework.
No, thank you.
And
I'll take that as a sort of as a final. Oh, Eric, you want to chime in?
Just one quick thought. I mean, I think
Sure.
To sum all that up, I think what I hear everybody saying is that it's being an entrepreneur is learning how to learn. Right? At the end of the day, like that's what you're doing constantly. If it's learning how to hire, learning how to do finances, learning how to, you're constantly learning and you're constantly growing new skill sets. If that's something that doesn't excite you, entrepreneurship is probably the wrong place to be.
That is a great place to end. Thank you first to all the panelists and for giving us so much of your time today and your insight and just being very, frankly, vulnerable and authentic today. Also, big thank you to PEC for hosting all of this and really taking the lead and putting this all together. It doesn't happen without the incredible work of Don and the team of people behind him at PEC to put all these events on. And certainly lastly, to all the people who stayed on for an hour plus on Zoom at the end of a day. And I know we're all doing tons and tons of Zoom calls. But just want to give my thanks. It's not quite over yet. Don's got a little bit more to do. But I just want to make sure we got the thank yous out of the way before folks started heading off.
The thank yous are shared by everyone at PEC, to all the panelists, and certainly to everyone who attended and showed such great enthusiasm. I just wanted to close as well to thank Laurence for working with the panelists and to moderate a great conversation. And the guy behind the scenes on PEC staff, Neil, for being the technical lead and making sure the webinar went smoothly. I am just showing on this last screen, as I mentioned at the outset, we've transitioned all of our events to a virtual format. There are many that are not on this calendar as of yet that will be on the calendar. So as long as you're on our newsletter mailing list, you will be informed of all of these various Tiger Talks, workshops, and some conferences, even at reunions, by the way. Of course, the reunions that will not occur physically, we are planning a virtual conference on the day of the 29th. So that'll be exciting as well. But the essence of these sessions are really to bring people together to engage alumni with their successes and their learnings. And for today's panelists, I think we had a great conversation. And again, I salute you. And thank you to all the alumni and friends and students who participated. And we'll see you shortly.
Thank you, everyone.
I'll keep the window open for chat input for a bit longer and for ideas. But we'll bring the webinar to a close. Again, thanks to everybody.
Is our contact information included with the bios?
In the bio is links to your LinkedIn profiles.
Okay.
So at a minimum, everyone can reach out to folks via LinkedIn.
Great.
And to any students that are on the line, I am actually hiring. So shoot me a note on LinkedIn or tweet me. I'm on Twitter too.
Follow alex.fyi on LinkedIn. Thank you.
There we go.
Thank you.
Awesome. Everybody have a great night.
Thank you.
Cheers.
All right, thank you, Don. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting for
Great.
the 43 participants out there.
Yep, it's fallen off quickly as I would expect. Thanks, Neil.
Bye, Don. Bye, everyone else. Have a good night.